The gate is open. Not wide, not broken, just enough to suggest that something has changed. The wire still holds its shape. The watchtowers stand where they always have, angled over the yard with the same quiet authority. But there is no one inside them. The ground is undisturbed. No orders are called. No footsteps move with purpose. The camp remains as it was, measured, contained, complete, except for the absence that now settles into it, slowly like dust. Nothing has been dismantled, and yet something essential has already left. If you find yourself drawn into this quiet space, into the stillness where change does not announce itself, but waits to be noticed, take a moment to settle in. And before you drift off, take a moment to subscribe, but only if stories told in whispers are your kind of thing. And let us know where you're listening from, or which moment stays with you the most. You're listening to Echoes of War. The silence does not arrive all at once. It gathers in small, almost imperceptible ways, settling first in the spaces where sound once repeated without question. The wooden walkways hold no rhythm of approaching steps. The air carries no sharp edge of instruction, no voice cutting across distance to be answered or obeyed. Even the wind, moving through the uneven lines of the camp, seems to hesitate as it passes between the barracks, as though uncertain whether it is allowed to continue. Nothing has been removed, and yet something has withdrawn so completely that its absence begins to take on weight. The buildings remain as they were, long, narrow structures of wood and corrugated metal, arranged in rows that once dictated movement without explanation. Their surfaces are worn in the same places, marked by hands, shoulders, and the slow erosion of time spent waiting. Doors hang slightly uneven on their hinges. Windows, clouded by dust and breath, reflect only a pale, indistinct light that offers no direction. From a distance, nothing appears altered. The camp still holds its shape, its boundaries, its quiet insistence on order. But the order no longer speaks. You find yourself watching the open ground between the barracks, where paths have been worn into the dirt by repetition rather than intention. They cross and overlap, tracing routes that once carried purpose without needing to be understood. Now they lie still, their meaning suspended. No one moves along them with urgency. No one calls others to follow. The ground remembers movement, but it does not demand it. Somewhere beyond the perimeter, the world continues in ways that cannot be seen from here. The horizon remains distant, flattened by heat or haze, offering no signal of change. The fences stand where they always have, lines of wire and wood that define the edge of the camp without explaining what lies beyond. They do not open. They do not close. They simply remain, as though the act of holding space is enough to justify their presence. Inside the barracks, the air is thick with stillness. The arrangement of sleeping spaces has not shifted. Personal belongings, few, worn, carefully kept, rest where they were last placed, as if expecting to be checked, counted, or inspected. There is no sign that these objects have been abandoned. They have not been claimed by absence. They wait, just as everything else does, within a structure that no longer confirms their purpose. There are people here. Their presence is not announced, not gathered into movement or sound, but it exists in the quiet adjustments of posture, in the slow turning of heads, in the way breath becomes visible in the early hours when the air cools just enough to reveal it. They remain within the spaces assigned to them, not because they have been told to, but because nothing has yet told them otherwise. Time does not stop, but it loses its markers. There is no signal to divide one part of the day from another. No routine begins, but none has fully ended. The light shifts gradually across the surfaces of the camp, touching roofs, then walls, then the ground, without prompting response. Shadows lengthen and recede without being measured. The passage of hours becomes something observed rather than followed. What has changed is not visible in any single place. It exists between things, in the distance between expectation and instruction, in the pause that follows a moment where something should happen but does not. The camp remains intact, but its center has been removed. What held it together was never a structure, never a material thing that could be pointed to or named. It was something carried in voice, in presence, in the certainty that action would be directed from somewhere beyond the self. Now that certainty is gone. You begin to notice how the space listens, how it seems to wait for a sound that does not come. The watchtowers, rising above the perimeter, hold their position against the sky, empty but unchanged. They do not collapse. They do not signal abandonment. They stand as they were built to stand, overlooking a space that no longer answers to them. Nothing declares what has happened. There is no moment that can be marked as the point of change, no line that separates before from after. The absence has unfolded quietly, without announcement, leaving everything in place but removing the force that once moved through it. What remains is not freedom, not yet, and not in any way that can be understood through action. What remains is a space that has stopped being directed, and within it, people who have not yet begun to move without direction. Morning does not begin with intention. It arrives as a gradual lifting of darkness, a soft exposure of surfaces that were already there, waiting to be seen again. The roofs of the barracks take on a faint, uneven light. The ground reveals its texture in slow detail. Dust, packed earth, the shallow depressions where feet have passed too many times to count. Nothing announces the start of the day. It unfolds without signal, without instruction, as though time itself has forgotten how to begin. Inside, the air shifts almost imperceptibly. Bodies adjust to the change in light before fully waking, movements small and contained, guided by something deeper than awareness. A shoulder turns. A hand searches for balance against wood that has been touched the same way for months, or longer. No one speaks to confirm what this moment is. No one calls it morning. It becomes morning only because it continues. The routines that once shaped these hours do not return all at once. There is no command to rise, but some do. Not together, not in sequence, but gradually, as if pulled upward by habit rather than necessity. The space between one movement and the next stretches longer than before. A person sits, then remains seated. Another stands, but does not leave the place where they slept. The body begins what it remembers, then pauses, uncertain whether to continue. You watch as small actions begin to form without direction. A blanket is folded, though no inspection follows. A space is cleared, though no one comes to check it. The motions are precise, almost careful, shaped by repetition that has not yet been interrupted. But there is something missing at the end of each action, a moment where purpose would normally settle, now left open, unfinished. Outside, the camp reveals itself again, unchanged in form. The pathways between the barracks remain visible, worn into the ground by movement that once followed a pattern too consistent to question. Now they hold no urgency. A few figures move along them, but without the pace that once carried them forward. There is no alignment, no shared direction. Each step seems to arrive independently, as though movement has been separated from command and left to find its own rhythm. The watchtowers remain still against the lightning sky. Their height suggests oversight, but their emptiness offers no confirmation. You can see into them now, the angles of wood and shadow that once concealed presence now exposed. There is nothing there to observe the camp, and yet the towers continue to define it, as if their function has not yet realized it has ended. At the edge of the camp, the fences hold their line. They stretch outward in both directions, marking a boundary that has not been tested. The wire catches the early light, thin and reflective, outlining a limit that remains unquestioned. No one approaches it directly. Not yet. The distance between where people stand and where the fence begins feels deliberate, even if no one has decided to keep it. It is not fear that holds them back. It is something quieter, more difficult to name. A continuation of understanding that has not yet adjusted to the absence of authority. The body remembers where it is allowed to go, even when permission no longer exists as something external. That memory does not fade quickly. It remains in posture, in distance, in the careful avoidance of edges that once defined consequence. Time moves, but it does not accumulate. There is no sense of progress, no indication that the day is advancing toward anything. Moments pass, but they do not build into a narrative that can be followed. Each action exists on its own, unconnected to what comes before or after. The day does not feel like a sequence. It feels like a series of isolated points, each one suspended in the same quiet uncertainty. You begin to understand that nothing has ended in a way that can be recognized. The guards have left, but their absence has not yet become meaning. It has not translated into instruction, into permission, into change that can be acted upon. The camp continues, not because it is maintained, but because it has not yet been undone. And in that space, where structure remains but direction has disappeared, something begins to take shape, not as movement, not as decision, but as a slow awareness that the conditions that define this place are no longer complete. It does not arrive as realization. It arrives as a pause that lasts longer than expected. The space without command. The camp holds its shape more firmly than the people within it. From a distance, nothing suggests that anything has changed. The rows remain aligned, their spacing exact, measured long before this moment and preserved without effort. The towers still rise above the perimeter, marking positions of oversight that no longer exist but have not yet been forgotten. Even the ground, pressed flat by repetition, retains its pathways as though movement continues beneath the surface, invisible but ongoing. What has shifted cannot be seen in the structure. It exists in the way the space is no longer answered. There was a time when every part of this place responded to something beyond itself. A voice, a signal, a presence that did not need to be constant to be understood. The response was immediate, automatic, carried out without pause because pause was not part of the system. Now the response has nowhere to go. The space remains prepared to receive instruction, but no instruction arrives. Inside the barracks, this absence settles slowly. The arrangement of bodies follows a pattern that has not yet broken. People sit where they have always sat. They move within the narrow limits assigned to them, navigating the same distances between sleeping spaces and doorways, between light and shadow. But the rhythm that once guided these movements has thinned. It no longer binds each action to the next. Instead, each movement seems to occur in isolation, beginning and ending without being acknowledged by anything outside itself. You notice how long a person can remain still now. Not the stillness of rest, but of waiting without knowing what is being waited for. A man stands near the entrance of the baroque, looking outward without stepping beyond the threshold. His posture suggests readiness, but there is no direction attached to it. The moment extends, held in place by something that has not yet been replaced. Across the open ground, the same pattern repeats in quiet variation. Figures appear at the edges of structures, pausing before entering or leaving, as if the act of crossing from one space to another requires confirmation that no longer exists. Movement does not stop, but it slows, interrupted by intervals that were not there before. These intervals accumulate, stretching the shape of the day into something uneven, without clear beginning or end. The pathways that cut through the camp begin to lose their authority. They are still visible, still the easiest way to move from one place to another, but they no longer carry expectation. No one is directed along them. No one is corrected for leaving them. A person steps slightly outside the worn line, then returns to it without thinking, as if the ground itself remembers the correct route even when the mind does not question deviation. The watchtowers stand above it all, unchanged in form but altered in meaning. Their height once implied a direction of attention, a downward gaze that organized everything beneath it. Now they hold no gaze. Their emptiness is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It is simply there, present in the angles of wood and shadow that reveal no movement. The absence of a watcher does not remove the sense of being watched. That sensation lingers, carried in posture, in the way people avoid lifting their eyes too long toward open space. You begin to understand that authority does not leave cleanly. It does not disappear at the moment of departure. It remains in the body, in the patterns of thought and movement that were shaped over time. The guards are gone, but the system they enforced has not yet released its hold. It continues, not through action, but through expectation, an expectation that something will happen, that something will resume. But nothing resumes. The day advances without confirmation. Light shifts across the ground, revealing details that were once overlooked. The texture of the earth, uneven in places where it has been disturbed, smooth where it has been pressed down. Small objects appear more visible now, scraps of material, marks left behind, traces of use that no longer serve a function. These details do not demand attention, but without instruction to focus elsewhere, they begin to hold it. In the distance, near the edge of the camp, a section of fence catches the light. The wire glints briefly, then fades as the angle changes. It remains intact, stretched tight between posts that have not been moved. Nothing indicates that it has been opened. Nothing suggests that it cannot be approached. And yet the space around it remains empty, as though an invisible boundary extends beyond the physical one, holding distance in place. You watch as someone begins to walk in that direction. The movement is slow, not cautious but measured, as if each step is being considered only after it has already been taken. There is no urgency in it, no sense of escape, no visible intention beyond the act of moving itself. The figure approaches the midpoint between the barracks and the fence, then stops. Not abruptly. The stopping happens the same way the movement began, without signal, without decision that can be seen. It is as if the body has reached a point it recognizes, even if the reason for that recognition is no longer present. The distance remains, untested, holding its shape without explanation. Nothing prevents the next step, and yet it is not taken. The figure remains where it has stopped, not fixed in place, but held in a quiet balance between movement and stillness. There is no visible hesitation, no outward sign of conflict. The posture is steady, the breathing unchanged, the gaze directed forward without strain. And yet something has settled into the space around that body, something that was not there before the step forward began. It is not a barrier. It does not push back. It simply exists, shaping what is possible without announcing itself as a limit. The distance between the barracks and the fence begins to take on meaning. It is not marked. No line has been drawn into the earth to indicate where one should stop and where one may continue. But the ground carries memory in a way that is difficult to see directly. It holds the repetition of past movement, the boundaries that were once enforced so consistently that they no longer required enforcement. That memory lingers in the body, guiding it without instruction, keeping it aligned with something that has already passed. You watch as the figure turns, not fully, but just enough to shift direction. The movement is small, almost incidental, as if it were always part of the path being followed. The return is slower than the approach, not because it requires more effort, but because it carries less certainty. Each step retraces ground that has already been crossed, but it does not restore the previous state. Something has changed, not in the environment, but in the awareness that movement outward is possible, even if it has not yet been completed. Across the camp, similar patterns begin to emerge. A door opens, then remains open longer than necessary. A person steps outside, then pauses without continuing. Another moves toward a familiar place, then stops short of reaching it, as though the destination no longer holds the same weight. These are not coordinated actions. They do not form a collective shift. Each occurs on its own, shaped by individual perception rather than shared understanding. The absence of command begins to reveal the presence of something else. It is not yet decision. It is not yet intention. It is the space in which both could exist, slowly becoming visible as the structures that once filled it remain empty. The camp does not collapse in response to this. It continues to stand, to contain, to define. But its definition is no longer complete. It no longer explains what should happen within it. Inside the barracks, this incompleteness settles differently. People remain where they have been, but the stillness has changed in quality. It is no longer entirely passive. There are moments now where attention shifts inward, where the absence outside begins to be mirrored by a quiet examination within. A hand rests against a wooden surface, feeling its texture without distraction. A gaze lingers on an object longer than before, as if waiting for it to reveal something it never needed to reveal. These moments do not accumulate into action. They exist as interruptions in the familiar flow of routine, brief openings that do not yet lead anywhere. The body returns to what it knows, not because it has chosen to, but because nothing has yet replaced it. The structure of behavior remains intact, even as its foundation begins to loosen. The watchtowers continue to overlook the camp without observing it. Their height still organizes the space visually, drawing the eye upward before returning it to the ground. But the direction of that gaze has changed. It no longer carries the weight of surveillance. It becomes something else, an empty perspective, a vantage point that exists without function. You can see the space as it might have been seen from above, but no one occupies that position now. This absence does not remove the feeling of being held within the camp. If anything, it deepens it. Without visible authority, the boundaries become more internal, less dependent on enforcement and more rooted in expectation. The fence does not need to be approached to be understood. The towers do not need to be occupied to define the space below them. The camp persists, not because it is actively maintained, but because it has been absorbed into the way people move, the way they pause, the way they remain. Time continues without marking itself. The light shifts again, higher now, flattening the shapes of the buildings and reducing the length of shadows. The air warms slightly, changing the texture of breath, the way it leaves the body and disappears. These changes are subtle, but they are continuous, carrying the day forward even as nothing else signals its progression. You begin to notice that the absence of command does not create immediate freedom. It creates delay. A delay between what is possible and what is acted upon. A delay between awareness and decision. A delay that stretches across the camp, settling into every space where movement might occur but has not yet begun. This delay does not feel temporary. It does not suggest that something is about to happen. It simply exists, holding everything in a state that is neither continuation nor change. At the edge of the camp, the fence remains untouched. The figure that approached it earlier has returned to the interior, blending back into the pattern of presence that fills the space without directing it. No one replaces that movement. No second attempt follows. The boundary remains where it is, not reinforced, not challenged, simply present. And within that presence, the camp continues to exist, not as a place that is controlled, not as a place that has been released, but as a place that has not yet decided what it is without the force that once defined it. The shape of waiting. Waiting does not begin as a decision. It settles gradually, almost unnoticed, shaping itself around the absence that has already taken hold of the camp. No one gathers to agree upon it. No signal announces that this is now the condition to be followed. And yet, as the hours extend without instruction, waiting becomes the only shared structure that remains. It appears first in the spaces between actions. A movement begins, then pauses before it completes. A person rises, then remains standing longer than necessary, as though something is expected to follow. The expectation is not clear. It has no defined source. But it persists, carried forward from a time when every action led to another, when movement was always part of a sequence that extended beyond the individual. Now that sequence has dissolved. What remains is the space where it used to exist. Inside the barracks, this space expands quietly. People sit or lie in positions that suggest rest, but the stillness is not restful. It holds a different quality, alert, but without focus. Eyes remain open longer. Breathing stays shallow, as though the body is prepared to respond to something that has not yet occurred. The absence of interruption does not relax the body. It prolongs its readiness. You notice how attention shifts toward the entrance. Not constantly, not in a way that draws attention to itself, but often enough to become a pattern. A glance toward the doorway. A slight turning of the head at a sound that might not be there. The expectation of arrival has not yet been removed, even though nothing has arrived for some time. The body continues to prepare for interruption, even as interruption fails to return. Outside, the open ground reflects this same condition in broader form. Figures move through the space without destination, tracing paths that do not lead anywhere new. The routes are familiar, repeated without variation, as though movement itself is enough to fill the time. There is no gathering point, no center toward which people are drawn. The camp has lost its focal point, and with it, the sense that time moves toward something. The watchtowers stand above this stillness, unchanged and unoccupied. Their presence does not interrupt the waiting. It reinforces it. They remain as markers of a system that once required constant attention, constant readiness. Even empty, they suggest that something might resume, that the absence is temporary, that the structure has only paused rather than ended. This suggestion does not come from the towers themselves, but from what they represent, from what they have held for so long. You begin to understand that waiting is not passive. It requires energy to maintain. The body holds itself in a state of partial readiness, neither fully active nor fully at rest. Muscles remain engaged without movement. The mind continues to anticipate without direction. This state cannot be sustained indefinitely, but it does not break easily. It stretches, extending itself across the hours, filling the space where action might have been. At the edge of the camp, the fence continues to define a limit that has not been tested. The distance between people and that boundary remains consistent, as though measured by something that no longer exists but has not yet been released. No one approaches it closely enough to confirm what lies beyond. No one moves far enough to discover whether the absence of guards changes the nature of the barrier. The possibility remains, but it is not pursued. You watch as a small group gathers near one of the barracks. They do not form a circle. They do not speak in a way that carries across the space. Their proximity suggests connection, but their stillness suggests uncertainty. They stand close enough to acknowledge one another, but not close enough to create direction. The group exists without purpose, held together by presence rather than intention. After a time, one of them moves away. The separation is quiet, unremarked, as though it does not require explanation. The others remain, but the shape of the group changes, becoming less defined, less necessary. Eventually, it dissolves entirely, leaving no trace beyond the memory of its brief existence. Waiting continues. It does not build toward decision. It does not lead to action. It simply extends, filling the camp with a condition that replaces command without offering anything in its place. As the day continues without division, waiting begins to take on weight. It settles into the body in ways that are not immediately visible, altering posture, slowing reaction, stretching the space between thought and movement. A person shifts position, then remains there longer than intended. Another begins to walk, then stops without reason that can be named. These interruptions do not feel like decisions. They feel like the absence of something that would have carried the action forward. The camp absorbs this condition without resistance. Nothing within it pushes back against the stillness. The buildings do not change. The ground does not shift. The structures that once enforced rhythm now simply contain it, allowing waiting to spread without interference. It moves through open spaces and enclosed ones alike, settling into corners, lingering near doorways, filling the narrow passages between sleeping areas where movement once passed without hesitation. Inside the barracks, time becomes more difficult to follow. There are no signals to mark its passage, no external events to divide one moment from another. The light changes gradually, but its movement is slow enough to be overlooked. A person looks toward a window, then looks away, unable to determine how much has changed since the last glance. The sense of duration weakens, replaced by a continuous present that does not clearly separate itself into before and after. You notice how sound behaves differently now. Without command, without the regular interruption of voices that once directed the space, smaller sounds begin to emerge. The movement of fabric, the shift of weight on wooden surfaces, the faint scrape of something being adjusted, then left alone. These sounds do not organize themselves into pattern. They appear and fade without sequence, reinforcing the sense that nothing is building toward anything else. The absence of sound does not create calm. It creates awareness. Each small noise becomes more distinct, not because it is louder, but because there is nothing to absorb it. The ear remains attentive, searching for something that would signal change, but finding only variation within stillness. This attention does not resolve into understanding. It remains open, extended, waiting for something that does not arrive. Outside, the open ground reflects the same quiet tension. Figures move less frequently now. The pathways remain visible, but they are used with decreasing regularity, as though movement itself requires justification that is no longer provided. A person crosses from one baroque to another, then remains there without clear purpose. Another steps outside, then returns almost immediately, as if the act of being outside has lost its meaning without direction to support it. The watchtowers continue to stand, their emptiness more apparent as the light shifts around them. Shadows form beneath their structures, stretching across the ground in long, thin shapes that move slowly with the sun. These shadows do not conceal anything. They do not suggest presence. But they mark time in a way that nothing else does, tracing a path that can be followed if one chooses to observe it long enough. Still, few do. The movement of shadow does not demand attention. It simply exists, unnoticed by most. At the perimeter, The fence holds its position unchanged. The wire remains taut, its lines unbroken, its purpose intact even if its enforcement has disappeared. The space near it remains largely empty, not by instruction, but by continuation. The distance is maintained, not because it must be, but because it has always been. That continuity carries forward, even as the reason for it has dissolved. You begin to sense that waiting is not leading anywhere. It does not feel like anticipation anymore. The expectation that something will resume begins to weaken, replaced by a quieter understanding that nothing may return in the way it once did. This understanding does not bring clarity. It does not immediately change behavior. It settles slowly, altering the way moments are held, the way time is experienced without direction. Inside the barracks, this shift is subtle but present. A person lies down without clear need for rest. Another remains seated, no longer looking toward the doorway as often. The body begins to release some of its readiness, but not entirely. It does not move fully into rest, nor does it return to action. It exists between the two, suspended in a condition that has not yet resolved into either. The small group that gathered earlier does not reform. No new group replaces it. The tendency to gather, to seek shared understanding, begins to fade, replaced by a quieter, more individual experience of waiting. Each person holds the condition differently, shaped by memory, by expectation, by the absence that now defines the space. There is no common response. There is only a shared environment in which responses remain unspoken. The day moves forward without marking its progress. Light shifts again, softening at the edges, beginning its slow descent without signaling that it has begun. The camp remains as it was at the start of the day, unchanged in form, altered only in the way it is experienced. Waiting has settled fully now, no longer a transition, but a condition in itself. And within that condition, something begins to loosen. Not enough to become action, not enough to become change, but enough to suggest that waiting, as it is now, cannot hold indefinitely. The memory of routine. Routine does not end when it is no longer required. It remains, carried forward by the body, repeating itself without needing to be confirmed. The absence of instruction does not immediately interrupt it. Instead, it continues in fragments, preserving the shape of what once was, even as its purpose begins to fade. Morning, if it can still be called that, unfolds with familiar motions. A person adjusts their sleeping space, smoothing fabric that no one will inspect. Another rises and clears a small area around them, creating order where no correction will follow. These actions are not performed with urgency, nor with conscious intent. They occur because they have always occurred, because the body remembers what to do when the day begins, even when the day no longer asks anything of it. Inside the barracks, this repetition creates a quiet rhythm. It is slower than before, less precise, but still recognizable. Movement follows patterns that have been established over time, connecting one action to the next without requiring thought. A hand reaches for an object in the same way it always has. A step is taken along a familiar path, avoiding obstacles that are no longer enforced but still expected. You notice how these actions no longer resolve into outcome. A space is arranged, but no one arrives to evaluate it. An object is placed carefully, but no one observes its placement. The completion of each action feels incomplete, as though something has been removed from the end of it, leaving it suspended without confirmation. The body continues anyway. It does not pause to question the absence of response. It moves through the sequence it knows, completing each step even when the reason for completing it has disappeared. This persistence is not conscious. It is not chosen. It is simply the continuation of something that has not yet been replaced. Outside, the camp reflects this same pattern in broader form. People move along the pathways again, not with the same regularity as before, but often enough to suggest that movement itself remains tied to memory. The paths guide the body even when no one has directed it to follow them. Feet find their place within the worn lines of earth, stepping where others have stepped, maintaining a pattern that no longer requires maintenance. The structures reinforce this repetition. The barracks, the open spaces, the alignment of buildings, all of it suggests a way of moving that has not yet been abandoned. The camp continues to present itself as something organized, something that expects to be used in a particular way. Even without instruction, that expectation lingers, shaping behavior in subtle, persistent ways. You watch as someone approaches a familiar location, a space where food was once distributed, where movement once gathered into purpose. The structure remains, unchanged in form, but empty of activity. The person pauses there, standing in the position they would have occupied before, waiting without fully realizing they are waiting. Nothing happens. After a moment, they adjust their stance, shifting weight from one foot to the other. The pause extends, then dissolves without conclusion. The person turns slightly, then moves away, not abruptly, but gradually, as if the absence of activity has been accepted without needing to be understood. The routine has reached a point where it can no longer complete itself. It begins, but it does not end. This incomplete repetition spreads through the camp, shaping behavior without fulfilling it. Each action carries the memory of its former purpose, but that purpose no longer arrives to meet it. The result is a series of gestures that remain intact in form but hollow in outcome. Inside the barracks, this hollowness becomes more noticeable. A person sits where they have always sat, but their posture changes slightly, as if the space no longer holds them in the same way. Another adjusts their belongings, then leaves them untouched, as though the act of arranging has lost its necessity. These changes are small, almost invisible, but they accumulate, altering the quality of the routine without breaking it entirely. The watchtowers continue to overlook this repetition. Their emptiness does not interrupt the pattern. It exists alongside it, a reminder of what once enforced these actions, now removed but not yet forgotten. The presence of the towers reinforces the memory of routine, even as the system that sustained it begins to loosen. At the perimeter, the fence remains unchanged. It continues to define the boundary of movement, even as the reason for that boundary has weakened. No one tests it directly. The routine of distance remains intact, carried forward without needing to be enforced. You begin to understand that routine is not dependent on authority alone. It becomes internal, and once internalized, it continues, even when the structure that created it has disappeared. As the day extends, the repetition begins to slow in ways that are difficult to measure. The actions remain recognizable, but the space between them widens. A person who once moved from one task to another without pause now lingers between gestures, as though the connection that once carried them forward has thinned. The sequence is still present, but it no longer holds itself together with the same certainty. Each step must now exist on its own before the next can follow. Inside the barracks, this separation becomes more visible. A blanket is folded, then left untouched for longer than necessary. A space is cleared, then observed without purpose. The body completes what it remembers, but it does not immediately move on. The pause that follows each action begins to take on its own presence, extending the moment beyond what routine once allowed. You notice how attention drifts during these pauses. It does not settle on anything in particular. It moves slowly across surfaces, resting briefly on objects that have lost their function, then shifting again without direction. A pair of hands remains still after completing a familiar motion, as if waiting for the next instruction to arrive, then gradually lowers without having received it. The routine continues, but it no longer contains time. It no longer organizes the day into segments that lead from one to another. Instead, it repeats in fragments, each one disconnected from the next, each one carrying the memory of continuity without fully achieving it. The result is not disorder, but a quieter form of disconnection, where structure exists without progression. Outside, the same pattern unfolds across the open ground. Movement becomes less frequent, more isolated. A figure crosses a path, then stops midway, not because something has interrupted them, but because the destination has lost its urgency. Another follows a familiar route, then deviates slightly, stepping outside the worn line before returning to it, as though testing the boundaries of habit without fully abandoning them. These small deviations do not accumulate into change. They appear, then disappear, leaving the overall pattern intact. The camp continues to function as if routine still governs it, even as the details within that routine begin to loosen. The pathways remain visible. The structures continue to suggest order. But the connection between movement and purpose continues to weaken. The space where food was once distributed remains empty. It draws occasional attention, not through activity, but through memory. A person approaches, stands in the place they would have occupied, then leaves without waiting as long as before. The pause is shorter now, not because understanding has arrived, but because the expectation has begun to fade. The body no longer holds the position as firmly as it did earlier in the day. This fading does not happen evenly. Some actions persist with greater clarity than others. Certain movements remain precise, repeated with little variation, while others begin to dissolve more quickly, losing their shape as they are performed. The difference is subtle, but it suggests that routine is not a single structure, but a collection of patterns, each one loosening at its own pace. Inside the barracks, the arrangement of space begins to shift in small ways. Not deliberately, not through conscious decision, but through the accumulation of minor changes. An object is left slightly out of place. A sleeping area expands or contracts without being corrected. These changes are not resisted. They are simply not restored, allowing the environment to drift from its previous order without fully abandoning it. The watchtowers remain unchanged, their emptiness now more familiar than before. They no longer draw the same level of attention. Their presence has been absorbed into the background, no longer signaling expectation, but no longer reinforcing it either. They stand as they always have, but their meaning has begun to recede, becoming less central to the way the space is experienced. At the perimeter, the fence continues to hold its line. The distance between it and the people within the camp remains largely consistent, but the awareness of that distance begins to soften. It is still observed, still maintained, but not with the same clarity as before. The boundary remains, but its significance has begun to blur, not enough to be crossed, but enough to be felt differently. You begin to sense that the body is adjusting, not through decision, not through understanding, but through the gradual release of patterns that no longer complete themselves. The routine does not end abruptly. It does not break. It thins, stretches, and begins to lose the force that once carried it forward. And within that thinning, something else begins to appear. Not yet action, not yet choice, but the first quiet spaces where repetition no longer fully occupies the moment. The weight of repetition. Repetition does not disappear when it begins to loosen. It deepens. What once moved easily from one action to the next now lingers, held in place longer than before, as though the absence of purpose has increased the effort required to continue. The body repeats what it knows, but each repetition carries more weight, more time, more space between beginning and end. Inside the barracks, this weight becomes visible in the smallest gestures. A hand reaches to adjust a blanket, then pauses before completing the motion. The fabric remains slightly uneven, not because it cannot be corrected, but because the correction no longer feels necessary. The movement resumes after a delay, slower than before, as if the act itself must now justify its continuation. You begin to notice how repetition extends the moment instead of passing through it. Each action holds longer in place, no longer part of a sequence that moves forward without interruption. A person sits, then shifts position, then remains in that new position without moving again. The shift does not lead anywhere. It does not prepare for the next action. It simply exists, complete in itself, yet connected to nothing beyond it. The body continues to follow familiar patterns, but those patterns no longer reduce effort. They increase it. What once required no thought now demands attention, not because it has become complex, but because it no longer resolves into outcome. The mind remains engaged longer, holding the action in place, waiting for a completion that does not arrive. Outside, the open ground reflects this same deepening of repetition. Movement becomes slower, more deliberate, not out of caution, but out of a lack of continuation. A person walks along a familiar path, but the pace has changed. Each step seems to carry more of the moment within it, as if the distance between steps has expanded without increasing the physical space between them. The pathways remain visible, but they no longer guide with the same certainty. They suggest direction, but they do not enforce it. A figure begins to follow one, then pauses midway, not because the path has ended, but because the movement itself has lost its momentum. The pause extends, then becomes part of the pattern, folding into the repetition rather than interrupting it. You watch as someone repeats a simple action several times. A small adjustment to their surroundings, performed again and again, each time with slight variation. The action does not improve the result. It does not change the environment in any meaningful way. But it continues, as though repetition itself has become the focus, replacing the outcome it once served. This repetition is not restless. It is contained. It does not escalate into urgency. It does not break into frustration. It remains quiet, almost measured, as if the body is testing the boundaries of what it remembers, repeating the action until it no longer holds the same meaning. The watchtowers stand unchanged, their presence now less active, more distant. They no longer seem to oversee the repetition. They exist alongside it, separate from the patterns unfolding below. Their emptiness has been absorbed into the environment, no longer drawing attention, no longer reinforcing expectation. They remain, but they no longer define the space in the same way. At the perimeter, the fence continues to hold its line without interruption. Its presence is constant, unchanged, but its relationship to the people within the camp begins to shift. It is still observed, still avoided, but not with the same clarity. The distance remains, but the awareness of that distance has become less precise, as though it is maintained out of habit rather than recognition. Inside the barracks, repetition begins to show signs of strain. The actions continue, but they no longer align as cleanly as before. Movements overlap, pause, then resume without forming a clear sequence. A person begins one task, then shifts to another before completing it, not out of distraction, but because the original action has lost its direction. The result is not disorder. It is a quieter form of disconnection, where repetition persists without coherence, where the body continues to move without being carried forward by what it does. You begin to understand that repetition, without purpose, does not sustain itself indefinitely. It accumulates, and in that accumulation, it begins to change. As repetition continues, it begins to settle more heavily into the body. The same actions return, but they do not feel the same. What was once automatic now lingers just long enough to be noticed, as though each movement carries a trace of its own emptiness. A person lifts an object, holds it for a moment longer than needed, then places it down without adjustment. The gesture is complete, but it does not resolve into anything beyond itself. Inside the barracks, this quiet accumulation becomes more apparent. Spaces that were once maintained through constant correction begin to drift. A blanket remains slightly folded, then slightly unfolded, then left in that state without further change. The difference is small, almost invisible at first, but it remains. No one returns to restore it. The repetition that would have corrected it does not arrive in time, and so the space begins to hold the mark of interruption. You notice how these interruptions do not disrupt the overall stillness. They settle into it. A person begins a familiar sequence of movements, then pauses midway and does not resume. The unfinished action remains present, not as something broken, but as something that no longer needs to continue. The body does not return to complete it. It simply moves on, leaving the gesture suspended in memory rather than in form. Outside, the open ground reflects this same quiet accumulation. Movement continues, but it no longer follows a consistent pattern. A figure walks along a path, then steps away from it earlier than before, not fully abandoning it, but not returning to it either. Another begins to cross the space between barracks, then changes direction without reaching the intended point. These shifts are subtle, but they suggest that repetition is no longer guiding movement with the same force. The pathways remain, but they begin to lose their authority. They no longer carry the body as they once did. They are followed, then left, then followed again, not with intention, but with a gradual loosening of habit. The ground still holds the memory of where people have walked, but that memory is no longer enough to determine where they will go. The watchtowers stand above this shifting pattern, unchanged but increasingly distant in meaning. Their emptiness no longer reinforces expectation. It no longer shapes behavior in the same way. The gaze that once moved downward from those structures has faded, leaving behind only the physical form without the function it once held. They remain visible, but they no longer organize the space beneath them. At the perimeter, the fence continues to define the edge of the camp, but its presence has begun to feel less fixed. The distance between people and that boundary is still maintained, but it is no longer as precise. A figure stands slightly closer than before, not near enough to touch, but near enough to alter the shape of the space. The change is small, but it remains, uncorrected, unremarked. You begin to sense that repetition is no longer holding the camp together. It continues, but it does not restore. It no longer returns the environment to its previous state. Instead, it allows small differences to remain, to accumulate, to slowly reshape the space without deliberate action. The result is not sudden change, but a gradual shift in how the camp exists. Inside the barracks, this shift becomes more visible in posture. People sit differently now. Not dramatically, not in a way that signals awareness, but in small adjustments that reflect the absence of expectation. The body no longer holds itself in the same alignment. It relaxes slightly in some places, remains tense in others, as though the pattern that once governed it has begun to dissolve unevenly. The incomplete actions, the small deviations, the lingering pauses, all of them begin to form a new condition, not yet defined, not yet stable, but present enough to be felt. You watch as a person begins to repeat an action, then stops after a single attempt. The repetition does not continue. The body does not feel compelled to complete the pattern. The action ends where it might once have begun again. The moment holds, then passes without returning to what it was. This is not the end of repetition, but it is no longer the same repetition that once defined the camp. It has changed, and in that change, the structure that held everything in place begins, quietly, to loosen. The first deviations. Deviation does not begin with intention. It appears as something smaller, almost indistinguishable from the routine it interrupts. A step taken slightly earlier than expected. A pause that lasts just long enough to alter the next movement. A direction shifted by a few degrees, not enough to be noticed by others, but enough to change the path that follows. Inside the barracks, these changes begin to gather in quiet ways. A person rises, then moves toward a space they do not usually occupy at this time. The movement is not deliberate. It carries the shape of habit, but not its exact pattern. They stop there, remain for a moment, then continue, as though the deviation has already been absorbed into what feels familiar. No one corrects it. No one observes it long enough to name it. The change exists, then settles into the environment without resistance. You begin to notice how these deviations do not disrupt the stillness. They move within it. A hand reaches for an object, then selects a different one instead. The difference is small, but it remains, unadjusted, unreturned. Another person crosses the baroque, but not along the usual path. They pass through a space that was once avoided, then continue without hesitation, as though the new route has always been available. These movements do not form a pattern yet. They are isolated, separate from one another, appearing and disappearing without connection. But they share something in common, a quiet shift away from repetition that no longer holds completely. Outside, the open ground begins to reflect this same condition. The pathways remain visible, but they are no longer followed with the same consistency. A figure walks along one, then steps away from it sooner than expected, continuing across the open space without returning. Another moves parallel to a path, close enough to acknowledge it, but not within it, as if the boundary of habit has become flexible. The ground does not resist these changes. It accepts them. The worn lines of movement remain, but they no longer define every step. New traces begin to form, faint at first, barely visible, crossing the older paths at angles that were not previously used. These traces do not yet hold the same weight, but they remain where they are made. You watch as someone approaches the edge of the camp again. Not the same person as before, not following the same route, but drawn toward the same boundary. The movement is slow, steady, not cautious but measured, as though each step is being felt rather than directed. They stop closer than before, not near enough to reach the fence, but near enough to alter the space around it. The pause that follows is shorter this time, not because the person understands something new, but because the hesitation has begun to loosen. The body does not hold the same distance as firmly. It allows itself to remain in this altered position without immediately returning. Nothing happens. The fence remains unchanged. The air does not shift. The space does not respond. After a moment, the person turns, not fully, but enough to begin moving away. The return is quieter, less defined, as though the act of approaching has already changed something that does not need to be confirmed. Across the camp, similar movements begin to appear. A person stands where they would not have stood before. Another moves through a space that was once avoided. These actions do not gather attention. They do not signal a shift in the collective. They remain individual, contained, unfolding within the larger stillness that continues to hold everything in place. The watchtowers overlook these deviations without responding. Their emptiness remains constant, but their meaning has changed. They no longer define what should happen below them. They simply exist, separate from the movements that unfold beneath their height. Inside the barracks, the same quiet changes continue. A sequence of actions begins, then shifts midway, not completing in the way it once did. The body does not return to correct it. It allows the deviation to remain, to become part of the pattern rather than an interruption of it. You begin to understand that deviation does not require permission. It emerges when repetition no longer fully occupies the moment. And once it appears, even in its smallest form, it does not entirely disappear. As the deviations continue, they begin to linger longer than before. They no longer disappear as quickly into the surrounding stillness. A person moves outside a familiar path and does not immediately return. Another pauses in a place they would not have remained before, allowing the moment to extend without correction. These changes are still small, still quiet, but they hold their position more firmly, as though the space has begun to accept them as part of its structure. Inside the barracks, this persistence becomes more noticeable. A sleeping area remains slightly altered, not restored to its previous arrangement. The shift is minor, but it endures, no longer absorbed by routine. A person sits in a different position, then continues to remain there, not out of decision, but because nothing requires them to move back. The body begins to settle into these new positions without resistance. You notice how the pauses have changed. They are no longer simply gaps between actions. They have become part of the action itself. A person begins to move, then slows, then continues, allowing the pause to shape the movement rather than interrupt it. The rhythm is no longer defined by repetition alone. It is shaped by variation, by moments that do not lead directly into what follows, but instead exist alongside it. Outside, the open ground reflects this same shift in subtle ways. The faint new paths that began to appear now hold more weight. They are used again, not consistently, but often enough to remain visible. A figure crosses the space at an angle that was not previously taken, then repeats that movement later, not as a habit yet, but as something that has become possible. The older pathways still exist, still guide movement, but they no longer contain it completely. Movement now flows between them, around them, sometimes ignoring them entirely. The ground begins to carry multiple patterns at once, overlapping, intersecting, without one fully replacing the other. The result is not disorder, but a quiet expansion of possibility. At the edge of the camp, the boundary shifts again, though not physically. A person stands closer than before, their presence altering the space in a way that is felt more than seen. The fence remains intact, unchanged, but the distance that once defined it has softened further. The body does not hold itself as far away. It remains within a space that was previously unoccupied. The pause at this distance is different now. It is not held by the same hesitation. It is shorter, less defined, as though the body no longer needs to confirm what it is doing. The awareness of the boundary remains, but it does not carry the same weight. It is observed, but not reinforced. After a moment, the person turns and walks back, not because they must, not because something has prevented them, but because the movement outward has already completed what it needed to complete. Across the camp, similar shifts begin to accumulate. A person crosses between barracks in a way that does not follow the previous alignment. Another remains outside longer than before, not returning immediately to the interior spaces. These actions remain uncoordinated, unspoken, but they begin to form a quiet pattern of change, one that does not replace the old, but exists alongside it. The watchtowers continue to stand, their emptiness now fully absorbed into the environment. They no longer draw attention. They no longer suggest oversight. Their presence has become neutral, no longer shaping behavior in any visible way. They remain as structures, but their function has dissolved into the background, no longer influencing the space below them. Inside the barracks, the changes continue to settle. Objects remain where they have been moved, not returned to their previous positions. The arrangement of space begins to reflect these small decisions, these slight deviations that are no longer corrected. The environment shifts gradually, shaped not by deliberate action, but by the absence of restoration. You begin to sense that deviation is no longer an interruption. It is becoming part of the condition itself. The body moves differently now, not entirely free, not entirely bound, but somewhere between the two. The patterns that once governed movement remain, but they no longer define it completely. They coexist with new possibilities, with small variations that continue to appear and remain. Nothing has changed all at once. There has been no moment of release, no clear transition from one state to another. But the space has begun to open, not outward, not yet, but within itself. And within that opening, the next movement no longer feels entirely predetermined. The edges of movement. Movement begins to extend toward the edges before it understands why. It does not surge outward. It does not gather force or direction. It lengthens quietly, almost without intention, carried by the same slow adjustments that have shaped every change so far. A step continues slightly farther than before. A pause occurs closer to the boundary. The difference is small, but it accumulates, drawing attention toward the limits of the space. At the perimeter, the fence becomes more present, not because it has changed, but because it is approached more often, observed from a shorter distance, held within awareness longer than before. The wire remains taut, its lines unbroken, its posts firmly set into the ground. It does not invite contact. It does not resist it. It simply exists, marking a boundary that is now being reconsidered without being challenged. You watch as a figure walks toward it, not directly, but along a path that curves slightly, as if avoiding the appearance of intention. The movement is steady, unhurried, shaped by the same quiet rhythm that governs the rest of the camp. The body does not lean forward with urgency. It remains upright, balanced, as though the act of approaching carries no more weight than any other movement. They stop closer than before, not within reach, but near enough that the details of the fence become clear. The thinness of the wire, the way it catches the light, the slight irregularities where it has been shaped and fixed into place. The person remains there, not examining it directly, but holding it within their field of view, as though the presence of the boundary is enough. Nothing interrupts the moment. No voice, no signal, no shift in the environment. The pause exists on its own, not as hesitation, but as observation extended beyond its usual length. After a time, the figure turns away, not abruptly, not with any visible conclusion, but with the same quiet continuity that brought them there. The movement back does not undo the approach. It leaves something behind, not in the space itself, but in the relationship between body and boundary. Across the camp, similar movements begin to appear. A person walks along the outer edge of the barracks, following a line that runs parallel to the fence, closer than before. Another moves through open ground that leads toward the perimeter, then stops midway, holding the distance in a way that suggests awareness rather than avoidance. These movements do not gather into a pattern yet. They remain individual, separate, unfolding at different times, in different places. But they share a direction, a quiet inclination toward the edge, as though the space itself is beginning to draw attention outward. Inside the barracks, this shift is less visible, but still present. People remain within the interior, but their orientation begins to change. A person sits facing the doorway longer than before. Another stands near the entrance without stepping outside, holding the threshold as a place of pause rather than passage. The interior space begins to open toward the exterior, not through action, but through attention. You notice how the thresholds begin to matter. Doorways, once passed through without thought, now hold the body in place. A step forward stops just at the edge. A movement outward pauses before it becomes departure. The boundary between inside and outside becomes a space of its own, neither fully occupied nor fully crossed. The watchtowers overlook these subtle extensions of movement without altering them. Their presence no longer defines the perimeter in the same way. The sense of being watched has faded, replaced by a quieter awareness of space itself. The towers remain, but they no longer hold authority over the edges. They stand as markers of what once shaped this boundary, now detached from its current meaning. The ground near the fence begins to show faint signs of repeated presence. Not enough to form a path, not enough to suggest regular use, but enough to indicate that the space is no longer untouched. Small disturbances appear in the earth, marks left by steps that have not been erased by routine. These marks remain, subtle but visible, adding to the quiet accumulation of change. You begin to understand that movement toward the edge is not driven by escape. It is driven by awareness. The boundary, once fixed and unquestioned, has become something that can be approached, observed, held within the moment without immediate consequence. This awareness does not lead directly to crossing. It lingers, shaping behavior without forcing it into action. And in that lingering, the edge of the camp becomes something new, not yet open, but no longer entirely closed. The edge does not announce itself as a turning point. It remains what it has always been, a line held in place by wire and wood, a boundary that separates one space from another without explaining what either space contains. And yet, as movement continues to extend toward it, the edge begins to gather a different kind of attention, one that lingers longer, one that does not immediately withdraw. The ground near the fence carries more traces now. They are still faint, still irregular, but they remain visible from one moment to the next. A slight indentation where a foot has pressed into the earth. A disturbed patch where the surface has been shifted and not restored. These marks do not form a path, but they do not disappear either. They accumulate, quietly, suggesting that the edge is no longer a place that is simply avoided. You watch as another figure approaches, this time more directly. The movement does not curve away from intention. It follows a straighter line, not hurried, not forceful, but less concealed. The body moves with the same measured pace as before, but the direction is clearer, less shaped by the need to appear incidental. They stop within reach of the fence, not touching, but close enough that the distance between body and boundary has nearly closed. The wire is visible in detail now, its thin strands intersecting in a pattern that has always been there, but rarely observed from this proximity. The posts stand solid, fixed into the ground, unchanged by the absence that has altered everything else. The boundary remains complete, not broken, not opened, simply present. The figure remains still. There is no immediate reaction, no movement toward contact, no attempt to test the barrier. The moment extends, held not by hesitation, but by observation. The body does not lean forward. It does not step back. It remains, allowing the closeness itself to exist without resolution. You notice how the space around them remains undisturbed. No one calls out. No one moves toward them. The camp continues its quiet rhythm, as though this proximity to the edge does not yet carry meaning for anyone beyond the person standing there. The act of approaching remains individual, contained within the experience of the one who has taken the step. After a time, the figure shifts slightly, not away from the fence, but along it, a step to the side, following the line of the boundary rather than moving through it. The movement is slow, deliberate, as though the edge itself is now something to be traced rather than avoided. The body remains close, maintaining the distance that has already been reduced, but not closing it further. This movement along the boundary repeats elsewhere. Another figure, farther down the perimeter, mirrors the same pattern. A step toward the fence, then a turn, then a slow progression along its length. These movements are not coordinated. They do not form a collective action, but they share a quiet similarity, as though the edge has begun to suggest a new kind of movement, one that does not yet lead beyond it. Inside the camp, the thresholds begin to shift in response. Doorways are crossed more frequently, but not always with continuation. A person steps outside, then remains near the entrance rather than returning immediately. Another moves between interior and exterior spaces without fully committing to either, as though the distinction between inside and outside has begun to soften. The watchtowers stand above this quiet expansion of movement, their emptiness now fully integrated into the landscape. They no longer define the boundary. They no longer hold the edge in place. The sense of oversight has dissolved, leaving behind only the physical structure, no longer connected to the behavior it once shaped. The edge exists now without being watched, without being enforced, held only by its own presence. You begin to sense that the boundary is no longer fixed in the same way, not physically, but in how it is experienced. The distance that once defined it has changed. The approach no longer carries the same weight. The body no longer holds itself back with the same certainty. The edge remains, but its meaning has begun to shift, becoming something that can be explored without immediately being crossed. The figure at the fence eventually steps away, not abruptly, not as a retreat, but as a continuation of movement that has already completed something. They return to the interior of the camp, but the space they leave behind does not return to what it was. The closeness remains, held in the memory of the movement, in the marks on the ground, in the quiet understanding that the boundary can be approached without consequence. Across the camp, this understanding begins to settle, not as a decision, not as a shared realization, but as a condition that is now part of the environment. The edge is still there. The fence still stands, but the space between the body and that boundary is no longer what it was. And within that changed distance, something continues to open, slowly, without declaring itself, without yet becoming action. The quiet emergence of choice. Choice does not arrive as a clear moment. It does not declare itself in the way command once did, with direction that could be followed without question. It appears more quietly, less certain, carried within the small spaces that have opened between repetition and deviation. At first, it is difficult to distinguish from the patterns that came before it, because it borrows their shape, moving through familiar gestures while altering them in ways that are almost invisible. Inside the barracks, this change begins in hesitation that does not resolve in the same way. A person prepares to follow a familiar sequence of movement, then pauses longer than before, not waiting for instruction, but holding the moment as if something within it must be considered. The body does not immediately continue. It remains, balanced between what it has always done and what it has not yet done, as though both are equally possible. The continuation, when it comes, is not identical. A step is taken in a slightly different direction. A movement ends sooner than expected. The difference is small, but it is not absorbed back into routine. It remains distinct, marking a separation between what has been repeated and what has been chosen, even if that choice has not been fully recognized. You begin to notice how these moments do not follow one another in sequence. They appear, then disappear, then return in different forms. A person crosses the barack along a path that is not entirely familiar, then later returns to the usual route, then deviates again, as though the two patterns exist side by side, neither fully replacing the other. The body moves between them without committing to either. Outside, the open ground reflects this same condition. Movement becomes less predictable, not chaotic, but less bound to the patterns that once defined it. A figure walks toward a familiar location, then turns before reaching it, not out of distraction, but as if the destination no longer determines the movement. Another begins to follow a path, then leaves it midway, not returning, continuing across the open space without clear direction. These movements do not gather into a shared pattern. They remain individual, shaped by internal shifts rather than external signals. The camp does not change all at once. It adjusts in fragments, each person moving slightly differently, each action carrying a variation that does not need to be corrected. The absence of correction becomes more noticeable. Where once deviation would have been followed by immediate response, now it passes without acknowledgement. A person stands where they would not have stood before, and no one redirects them. Another moves through a space that was once restricted, and nothing interrupts their movement. The environment does not respond. It allows. The watchtowers continue to stand, but their presence no longer influences these moments. They do not observe. They do not enforce. They exist as remnants of a structure that has lost its connection to the present condition. Their height no longer carries authority. It remains only as form, detached from function. At the perimeter, the fence continues to mark the boundary, but the relationship to it has shifted further. A figure approaches, pauses, then remains close without turning away. The movement is not hesitant in the same way as before. It is more settled, as though the act of being near the boundary has become part of what is possible, rather than something that must be undone. They do not cross, but they do not retreat immediately either. The space between body and boundary is held, not as a limit, but as a position that can be occupied without consequence. Inside the camp, similar positions begin to appear. A person remains outside longer than before, not returning to the barack as quickly. Another sits near an entrance, facing outward, not because they intend to leave, but because the orientation itself has become available. These positions are not fixed. They shift, dissolve, return in different forms, but they remain present. You begin to sense that something has changed in how movement is determined. It is no longer carried entirely by memory. It is no longer guided entirely by habit. There is a space now where movement can begin without being fully defined by what came before. That space is not yet stable. It does not produce consistent action. But it exists, and it continues to appear. Choice, if it can be called that, does not feel deliberate. It does not feel like a decision made with clarity. It feels like a slight turning within the body, a shift that alters the direction of movement without fully explaining why. And once that turning occurs, even in its smallest form, it does not entirely return to what it was before. As the day moves forward without being measured, the small turnings begin to hold their place a little longer. They do not disappear as quickly into the background of movement. A person begins one path, then alters it midway and continues in the new direction without returning. The change is not dramatic. It does not announce itself as a break from what came before. But it remains, carried forward instead of corrected, as though the body has begun to accept its own variation. Inside the barracks, this persistence gathers in subtle ways. A space that has shifted is no longer restored. An object moved earlier remains where it has been placed, becoming part of the arrangement rather than an interruption of it. A person chooses where to sit, not entirely by habit, but by something quieter, something that no longer needs to match what has always been done. You notice how the pauses have changed again. They no longer feel like waiting. They feel like moments in which something is being considered, even if that consideration is not fully conscious. The body holds still, not because it expects instruction, but because it is no longer certain that instruction is required. The stillness becomes active in a different way, not directed outward, but held inward, shaping what comes next. Outside, the open ground reflects this same shift in quiet variation. Movement no longer follows a predictable pattern of repetition and deviation. It becomes more fluid, less tied to specific routes or destinations. A figure crosses the space between barracks, not along a path, but across it, choosing a line that has not yet been worn into the ground. The step is not tentative. It is simply taken, and then followed by another. The ground begins to carry these new traces more clearly. They intersect with the older paths, forming patterns that do not align, but do not conflict either. The space becomes layered with movement, each layer representing a different way of crossing it, none fully replacing the others. The result is a quiet complexity, a landscape shaped by both memory and change. At the edge of the camp, the boundary continues to be approached, but the nature of that approach has shifted. A figure stands near the fence, then reaches out, not to grasp, not to test, but to feel the space between. The hand remains just short of contact, hovering in the air where the boundary begins. The moment is held, not as hesitation, but as awareness extended into proximity. After a time, the hand lowers. The body remains. There is no urgency to move away, no immediate return to the interior. The position near the boundary has become something that can be occupied without needing to be resolved. The edge is no longer only a limit. It is a place where presence can remain. Elsewhere along the perimeter, similar moments unfold. A person walks along the fence, not tracing it exactly, but staying close enough to feel its line. Another stands at a distance, then moves slightly closer, then remains there, allowing the new position to settle without correction. These movements do not gather into a shared action. They remain individual, but they reflect a common shift in how the boundary is experienced. The watchtowers, still and empty, no longer frame these moments in any meaningful way. Their presence has receded fully into the background, no longer shaping perception, no longer influencing behavior. The space beneath them has begun to define itself without reference to what once overlooked it. Inside the camp, the same quiet emergence continues. People move between spaces without following the same sequences as before. A person leaves a barack, then does not return immediately. Another remains outside longer than expected, not because they intend to leave, but because the need to return has weakened. The distinction between interior and exterior becomes less rigid, less tied to a fixed pattern. You begin to sense that choice is no longer isolated. It is appearing more frequently, more consistently, though still in small forms. Not as decisions made with clarity, but as movements that no longer require the same justification. The body begins to trust its own direction, even if that direction is not fully understood. The patterns that once governed movement remain, but they no longer define it completely. They exist alongside these new variations, these small shifts that continue to appear and remain. Nothing has changed all at once. There is no moment that marks the arrival of something new. But the space has begun to move differently, not because it has been told to, but because it no longer needs to be told in the same way. And within that quiet shift, the next step no longer feels entirely bound to the last. The fading shape of the camp. The camp does not disappear. It remains where it has always been, its structures intact, its boundaries visible, its arrangement unchanged in form. And yet, as the patterns within it continue to loosen, its shape begins to fade in a way that cannot be measured by distance or sight. It is still there, but it no longer holds everything in the same way. Inside the barracks, this fading begins as a quiet shift in how space is occupied. People remain, but not always in the same relation to one another. The distances between them change slightly, not through deliberate movement, but through the absence of correction. A person sits closer to an entrance than before. Another rests farther from the center of the room, allowing the space to expand around them. These changes are small, but they remain, gradually altering the balance of the interior. You notice how the arrangement no longer restores itself. The order that once held each object, each body, in a fixed position begins to loosen. A space that shifts is not returned to its original form. An object moved earlier remains where it has been placed, becoming part of a new arrangement that is not defined by the old system. The environment begins to carry these changes without resisting them. The barracks still contain, but they no longer organize. Outside, the open ground reflects this same fading of structure. The pathways remain visible, but they no longer guide movement with the same clarity. People cross them, leave them, return to them, without fully committing to any one route. The ground becomes a surface of possibilities rather than a set of defined lines. The older patterns remain, but they no longer dominate. You watch as a figure crosses the space between two barracks in a line that does not follow any existing path. The movement is steady, unforced, as though the absence of direction has created room for something else to emerge. The step is not hesitant. It does not search for confirmation. It continues until the crossing is complete, leaving behind a trace that may or may not be followed again. These traces begin to overlap. They intersect with older paths, with other deviations, forming a quiet network of movement that does not align with the original design of the camp. The space becomes layered, holding multiple patterns at once, none of them fully dominant, none of them fully erased. At the perimeter, the boundary continues to hold its form, but its meaning has shifted further. The fence still stands, its structure unchanged, its line unbroken. But the space around it no longer feels as fixed. People move closer, remain longer, walk along it without withdrawing as quickly. The edge has become part of the interior experience, no longer something entirely separate. You notice how the distance between people and the fence is no longer consistent. It varies, expanding and contracting without being corrected. One person stands near it, another remains farther away, neither position carrying more weight than the other. The boundary exists, but it no longer organizes the space in the same way. The watchtowers continue to rise above the camp, but their presence has diminished into the background. They are no longer central to how the space is understood. Their height remains, their structure unchanged, but they no longer hold attention. The gaze that once moved upward toward them has shifted elsewhere, or has disappeared entirely. The towers remain, but they no longer define. Inside the camp, the same fading continues. The distinctions between spaces begin to blur. The interior and exterior no longer hold the same separation. A person moves between them without marking the transition, as though the boundary between inside and outside has softened. The camp begins to feel less like a contained system and more like a series of connected spaces without clear division. You begin to understand that the camp is not ending. It is dissolving, not through destruction, not through removal, but through the gradual loss of the structure that gave it meaning. The physical form remains, but the system that defined it has begun to fade, leaving behind something that no longer functions in the same way. And within that fading, the space begins to open, not outward, not yet, but inward, altering what it means to remain within it. As the fading continues, the camp begins to feel less like a place that contains and more like a place that lingers. Its structures remain, but they no longer hold the same weight. The barracks stand as they were built to stand, their walls unchanged, their roofs intact, but the sense that they define where one belongs has weakened. A person remains inside, then steps outside, then returns, not because one space calls them more strongly than the other, but because the distinction between the two has begun to soften. Inside, the arrangement continues to drift. The positions of objects, of bodies, of movement, none of it restores itself to a fixed pattern. A space once kept precise now holds variation without correction. A sleeping area extends slightly, then contracts, then remains in that altered form. The changes are not organized, not directed, but they remain, accumulating into a new kind of order that does not resemble what came before. You notice how the interior no longer feels enclosed in the same way. Not because the walls have moved, but because the body no longer responds to them as boundaries. The edges of the room are still there, but they do not hold attention. Movement within the space does not orient itself around them. The sense of being contained has thinned, replaced by something less defined, less restrictive, though not entirely open. Outside, the open ground reflects this same transformation. The pathways, once central to movement, have become one of many possibilities. They are used, but not exclusively. New routes cross them, diverge from them, intersect without forming a single dominant pattern. The ground carries all of these traces at once, holding the memory of structure alongside the presence of change. You watch as two figures move across the space without acknowledging one another. Their paths cross, but do not align. Each follows a line that does not depend on the other, not out of separation, but because the shared structure that once connected movement has weakened. They pass through the same space without forming a pattern, each carrying their own quiet variation. At the perimeter, the boundary continues to exist, but it no longer holds the same position in the experience of the camp. People approach it, stand near it, move along it, but they do not orient themselves around it in the same way. The fence is still there, its structure unchanged, but it has become part of the landscape rather than a defining edge. It no longer separates as clearly as it once did. It simply remains. The distance to it is no longer consistent. Some stand close, others farther away, and the difference no longer feels significant. The boundary has lost its uniform influence. It exists, but it does not organize the space around it with the same clarity. The watchtowers, still and empty, fade further into the background. They no longer draw the eye. They no longer shape the perception of the space. Their presence is absorbed into the environment, becoming just another structure among many, no longer central, no longer defining. The absence they represent has become complete, no longer needing to be acknowledged. Inside the camp, the same quiet dissolution continues. The roles that once existed, defined by position, by movement, by expectation, have begun to loosen. A person no longer occupies a space in the same way. They move through it, remain within it, leave it, without carrying the same identity tied to that location. The connection between place and role has weakened, leaving behind something less fixed. You begin to sense that the camp is no longer a system. It is becoming a collection of spaces without a single function. The structures remain, but they no longer work together to produce a single outcome. Each part exists on its own, connected physically, but no longer bound by the same purpose. The result is not chaos, but a quiet fragmentation, where everything continues, but not in the same way. Nothing has been removed. Nothing has been destroyed. But the meaning has thinned to the point where the form no longer fully explains itself. And within that thinning, the space begins to release what it once held, not all at once, not outwardly, but through a gradual shift in how it is lived. The camp remains, but it no longer defines what it contains. The quiet loss of roles. Roles do not disappear when the system that created them fades. They remain for a time, carried within posture, within movement, within the way a person occupies space. The body continues to hold itself as it has been shaped to hold itself, even when the structure that required that shape has begun to dissolve. Inside the camp, this persistence is visible in the way people move in relation to one another. There are still distances that are maintained, not by instruction, but by memory. A person stands slightly apart, as though their position once required it. Another moves through space with a familiarity that suggests a role that has not yet been released. These differences are subtle, but they remain, shaping the environment in ways that are not immediately recognized. You notice how these positions do not carry the same weight. They are present, but they are not reinforced. No one adjusts them. No one responds to them. The structure that once confirmed their meaning has withdrawn, leaving the form without the force that sustained it. A person who once occupied a particular place continues to return to it. They stand there, not out of obligation, but because the body remembers that this is where it belongs. The position holds for a moment, then loosens, then holds again, as though the memory of the role is being repeated without fully resolving into action. Across the camp, similar patterns unfold. Movement still reflects traces of hierarchy, of order, of separation that once defined interaction. But these traces no longer organize behavior in the same way. They appear, then fade, then return in altered form, as though the roles themselves are being carried forward without the system that gave them meaning. Outside, the open ground reflects this quiet persistence. People cross the space without gathering into formations, but their movement still carries echoes of alignment. The distances between them suggest patterns that once existed, even as those patterns begin to dissolve. A figure walks ahead, another follows at a distance that feels familiar, though no one has established it. The formation does not hold. It loosens as quickly as it appears, dissolving into individual movement without resistance. The pattern is not maintained. It is not restored. It exists briefly, then fades, leaving behind only the memory of its structure. At the perimeter, the same quiet loss begins to appear. A person stands near the fence, not as a boundary to be observed, but as a place once associated with a role. The position holds for a moment, then shifts. The body no longer maintains the same distance with the same certainty. The role that once defined that space no longer anchors it. The fence remains, but the meaning of standing near it has changed. The watchtowers, empty and still, reflect this loss more clearly than anything else. They once held positions that defined everything beneath them. Now they hold nothing. Their emptiness is not new, but its significance has deepened. They stand as structures without roles, as forms that no longer carry the function that gave them meaning. You begin to understand that roles do not end at the same pace as structure. They linger. They repeat. They fade unevenly. Inside the barracks, this uneven fading becomes more apparent. A person moves through a space with the posture of someone who once had a defined place within it. Another avoids a certain area without fully knowing why. These behaviors persist, not because they are required, but because they have not yet been released. But they are not reinforced. They are not returned to their original clarity. They begin to drift, to loosen, to lose the precision that once defined them. You notice how the interactions between people begin to change. Not dramatically, not in a way that draws attention, but in small adjustments of distance, of orientation, of movement. A person stands closer than before. Another does not move away as quickly. The space between them shifts, not because of decision, but because the roles that once defined that space have weakened. The result is not a new structure. It is the absence of the old one. And within that absence, the body begins to move without the same constraints, even if it has not yet fully recognized that those constraints are gone. As the hours pass without being marked, the roles begin to thin further, not disappearing all at once, but loosening in places where they once held firm. A person stands in a position that once carried meaning, then shifts without replacing it with anything else. The movement does not feel like a change. It feels like a release that has no clear direction. The space that remains is not filled. It is simply left open, as though the role that once occupied it has stepped away without being replaced. Inside the barracks, this quiet release becomes more visible in how people occupy the same space. Distances that were once maintained with consistency begin to vary. A person sits closer to another than before, not in a deliberate way, not as an attempt to connect, but because the distance that once defined separation no longer holds the same weight. Another remains where they are, not adjusting to restore the previous arrangement. You notice how these changes do not produce reaction. No one corrects them. No one acknowledges them. They remain as they are, settling into the environment without resistance, as though the structure that once required adjustment has faded beyond the point of return. The body begins to move without referencing position in the same way. Where once movement carried an awareness of where one should be, now it unfolds with less attachment to place. A person crosses the baroque without following the same line as before. Another remains near an entrance without moving inward or outward, holding a position that does not correspond to any previous role. Outside, the open ground reflects this same quiet dissolution. Figures move without forming patterns of alignment or separation. The distances between them change, expand, contract, without being restored. Two people pass near each other without adjusting their paths to maintain a previous order. The movement continues, but the relationships that once shaped it have loosened. The ground carries these changes without resistance. The older patterns remain faintly visible, but they no longer guide interaction. The space between people is no longer defined by structure. It becomes fluid, shifting with each movement, no longer anchored by roles that once held it in place. At the perimeter, the boundary continues to exist, but the positions associated with it have faded. A person stands near the fence, then moves away without holding that position as long as before. Another approaches, but not in the same way, not with the same posture. The edge is no longer tied to a role that must be maintained. It is simply part of the environment, approached and left without carrying the same meaning. The watchtowers remain as the clearest absence of all. Their emptiness now feels complete, not as something that has recently changed, but as something that has settled fully into the space. They no longer suggest what once was. They simply exist, detached from any role, their presence neutral, almost unnoticed unless deliberately observed. Inside the camp, the final traces of role begin to dissolve. A person who once moved with a certain pattern no longer repeats it. Another who once avoided a space now moves through it without hesitation. These changes are not dramatic. They do not announce themselves. But they remain, uncorrected, unreturned, forming a new condition in which the body is no longer shaped by what it once had to be. You begin to sense that the space no longer assigns position. It no longer holds people in place through expectation or memory. The roles that once defined movement, distance, and interaction have loosened to the point where they no longer organize the experience of the camp. What remains is presence, not defined by function, not shaped by instruction, but simply existing within a space that no longer tells it what to be. The camp continues to stand. The structures remain. The boundaries are still visible, but the roles that once gave them meaning have faded beyond recognition. and within that quiet absence, something unfamiliar begins to take shape, not imposed, not directed, but emerging from the space that has been left behind. The unclaimed outside. Beyond the fence, the land has not changed. It stretches outward in the same quiet continuity it always held, unaffected by the structures that define the camp. The horizon remains distant, the ground uneven in places, open in others, shaped by wind and time rather than by instruction. Nothing beyond the boundary signals that it has become available. Nothing invites movement toward it. It simply exists, as it always has, waiting without intention. From within the camp, this outside begins to take on a different presence, not as something distant, not as something unreachable, but as something that can now be seen without being immediately dismissed. The fence still marks the division, but the space beyond it no longer feels entirely separate. It is held within view longer, observed without the same automatic turning away. You watch as a figure stands near the boundary, facing outward. They do not approach the fence directly. They remain a short distance from it, holding the outside within their gaze. The posture is steady, not tense, not expectant, but attentive in a quiet, sustained way. The body does not move forward. It does not retreat. It remains in place, allowing the outside to exist without needing to be acted upon. The moment extends. Nothing changes in the landscape beyond. No movement appears to confirm that anything lies waiting. The ground beyond the fence holds its stillness, its openness, without offering direction. It does not draw the body forward. It does not push it back. Inside the camp, similar moments begin to gather. A person pauses near a doorway, looking outward longer than before. Another stands in open ground, oriented toward the perimeter without moving toward it. These positions do not form a collective shift. They remain individual, unfolding quietly, each one holding the outside within awareness without crossing into it. The boundary remains intact, but the relationship to it has changed. You begin to notice how the outside is no longer only defined by restriction. It begins to exist as something separate from the memory of what it once represented. The body does not immediately associate it with consequence. It does not carry the same immediate weight of prohibition. Instead, it becomes something that can be considered, held within thought without triggering action. The fence continues to stand between these two conditions. Its structure is unchanged, its lines clear, its presence undeniable. But it no longer holds the same certainty. It no longer fully explains why the outside has not yet been entered. It simply marks a division that is no longer reinforced in the same way. A figure moves closer. The approach is not concealed this time. It follows a direct line, steady and unbroken, as though the distance itself has lost some of its meaning. The body arrives near the fence and remains there, not reaching, not testing, but standing within a space that was once avoided entirely. The outside remains still. The inside remains unchanged. The boundary remains in place. And yet, something within this arrangement has shifted. You notice how the figure does not immediately turn away. The pause holds longer, not as hesitation, but as presence extended into a space that was once inaccessible. The body does not lean forward. It does not search for an opening. It simply remains, allowing the outside to exist within reach without being entered. Across the camp, similar moments unfold. A person walks along the perimeter, then stops to face outward. Another stands at a distance, then moves slightly closer, then remains. These actions do not gather into a shared movement. They remain separate, each one shaped by a quiet awareness that has not yet become decision. The watchtowers overlook this new orientation without altering it. Their emptiness no longer carries meaning in this direction. They do not define the outside. They do not shape the relationship between inside and beyond. They remain as structures that belong to what has already faded. Inside the camp, the same quiet shift continues. The outside is no longer ignored. It is not yet entered. It exists as something unclaimed, held within view, within awareness, without yet being taken into movement. And in that space, between presence and action, something begins to gather, slowly, without urgency, without declaration. The outside remains where it has always been, unchanged by the attention now given to it. It does not move closer. It does not become clearer. The ground beyond the fence holds its distance, its openness, without adjusting to the gaze that lingers upon it. The horizon remains flat and unbroken, offering no sign that it has shifted into something new. And yet, within the camp, the way it is seen has begun to alter. A figure stands near the boundary, then takes a step that carries them alongside it rather than away. The movement follows the line of the fence, not tracing it exactly, but remaining close enough to feel its presence without needing to test it. The body moves with a steady rhythm, unhurried, as though the act of staying near the edge has become something that can be sustained without requiring conclusion. You notice how this movement does not lead outward. It continues within the boundary, even as it aligns itself with what lies beyond. The body moves parallel to the outside, holding it in constant relation without crossing into it. The step forward is no longer directed inward alone. It carries the awareness of what lies beyond, even as it remains within. Elsewhere along the perimeter, similar patterns begin to form. A person stands facing outward, then turns and walks along the fence, not returning to the center of the camp, but remaining within this narrow space between interior and edge. Another approaches, pauses, then shifts position slightly, choosing to remain near the boundary rather than moving away. These movements begin to create a quiet band of presence along the edge. Not a path, not a formation, but a region where the body lingers, where movement slows, where attention holds steady between what is inside and what is beyond. This region does not replace the interior. It exists alongside it, expanding the experience of the camp without dissolving it completely. Inside, the same quiet extension becomes visible in how space is used. People move toward the outer areas more often, not leaving the interior entirely, but not remaining within it in the same way. The center of the camp no longer draws movement as strongly. The edges begin to hold more of it, as though the space itself has shifted its balance. You watch as a person crosses from the interior toward the perimeter, not with urgency, not with clear intention, but with a steady continuation of movement that does not turn back as quickly as before. They arrive near the fence and remain. The outside lies just beyond, unchanged, unentered. The moment holds, not as hesitation, but as a sustained presence within reach of something that has not yet been claimed. The fence continues to stand between these two conditions, but its role has thinned. It still marks the boundary, but it no longer fully explains why that boundary remains. The body does not press against it. It does not attempt to pass through it. It simply exists near it, holding the outside within a space that has not yet become action. The watchtowers remain distant, their emptiness now complete. They do not frame this moment. They do not define the edge. Their presence has receded beyond relevance, leaving the relationship between inside and outside to exist without oversight, without structure, without explanation. You begin to sense that the outside is no longer entirely separate. It has entered the experience of the camp without being physically entered. It exists in the orientation of bodies, in the direction of gaze, in the quiet shift of movement toward the edge. The boundary remains, but it no longer isolates in the same way. And yet, the outside is still unclaimed. No step has carried beyond it. No movement has completed the transition. The possibility exists, held within reach, but not yet taken. The camp remains. The outside remains. And between them, a space has formed where both are present at once, where neither fully defines what happens next. Within that space, the moment stretches, quiet and unresolved, holding the shape of something that has not yet decided to begin. The first crossings. The crossing does not begin with certainty. It begins the same way everything else has begun here, quietly, without announcement, without a moment that can be clearly marked as the beginning. The boundary remains as it was, the fence intact, the posts unmoved, the wire stretched in the same lines that have defined the edge of the camp for as long as it has existed. Nothing has opened. Nothing has been altered. And yet, the relationship to that boundary has changed enough that something once unthinkable becomes possible. At the perimeter, a figure stands closer than before. The distance between body and fence has been reduced to almost nothing, not through urgency, not through force, but through the gradual shortening of hesitation. The posture is steady, the gaze not fixed on any single point, but held within the space where the boundary exists. The body does not lean forward. It does not test the wire. It simply remains. The moment extends. There is no signal to move. There is no confirmation that movement is allowed. The outside remains still, offering no invitation, no reassurance. The camp behind remains unchanged, holding its quiet patterns of movement and stillness without drawing attention back inward. The figure exists between these two conditions, not pulled by either, not held by either, balanced in a space that has not yet resolved. Then, without visible decision, the body shifts. A step is taken, not toward the fence in the way previous approaches have been, but into a space that does not follow the old alignment. The movement does not match any previous pattern. It does not retrace the familiar routes that once guided every step. It continues forward in a way that does not immediately explain itself. The fence is no longer the only boundary. There are spaces within it, gaps where the wire has loosened slightly, where the ground beneath it is uneven, where the line it forms is not perfectly continuous. These spaces have always been there, unnoticed, irrelevant under the presence of authority. Now they begin to hold a different significance. The figure moves along the fence, not tracing it exactly, but remaining close enough to feel its variations. The movement is slow, deliberate, as though the boundary is being read for the first time. The eye does not search quickly. It lingers. The body does not rush. It continues, step by step, allowing the space to reveal itself without forcing it to. You watch as the figure reaches a place where the fence does not hold as tightly. A slight opening, not large, not clearly defined, but present enough to be noticed when one is close enough to see it. The wire dips slightly. The ground beneath it rises unevenly. The boundary is still there, but it is not as complete as it once appeared from a distance. The figure stops. The pause is longer than before, but different. It does not carry the same hesitation. It holds something else, an awareness that the boundary is not absolute, that it contains within it spaces that were never meant to be used, but are now visible. The body does not immediately move through. It remains, holding the space, allowing the possibility to exist without acting upon it. The outside remains unchanged. The inside remains where it is. The boundary, for the first time, reveals that it is not entirely fixed. Across the camp, similar moments begin to unfold. Not yet crossings, but recognitions. A person stands near the fence and notices a place where it bends differently. Another moves along the perimeter and pauses at a point where the ground meets the wire in a way that suggests something less solid than before. These observations do not gather into action. They remain separate, individual, held within the quiet awareness that has been building. Inside the camp, movement continues as it has, but with a subtle shift. The edges draw more attention. The interior no longer holds the same weight. The center of the camp begins to feel less central, as though the focus has moved outward, toward the boundary that is no longer entirely understood. The watchtowers remain, distant and empty, no longer part of this unfolding. They do not observe. They do not define. They stand as remnants of something that no longer governs what happens at the edge. You begin to understand that crossing does not begin at the moment of stepping beyond. It begins earlier, in the recognition that the boundary is not complete, in the awareness that what once held firm contains within it the possibility of passing through. And in that awareness, something begins to shift, not outward yet, but within the space that has been held in place for so long. The opening does not demand to be used. It remains where it is, small, irregular, shaped more by time than by intention. The wire dips slightly, the ground beneath it uneven, the space just wide enough to be noticed by someone who has come close enough to look. It has always been there, but it has never held meaning. Now it does, not because it has changed, but because the way it is seen has shifted. The figure remains before it. The body does not lean forward. It does not reach. The moment extends, not as hesitation, but as a quiet holding of possibility. The outside remains still beyond the fence, unchanged, uninviting, offering no signal that it is different from what it has always been. The inside remains behind, carrying its softened patterns, its fading structures, its quiet dissolution. Nothing directs what happens next. The step that follows is small. It does not resemble a break from what came before. It does not carry the force of decision. It continues the same quiet movement that has shaped everything else. The body lowers slightly, the posture adjusts, and then, without visible effort, it passes through the space that had once been overlooked. There is no resistance, no sound, no interruption. The crossing is complete before it is fully understood. On the other side, the body remains still. The ground feels the same beneath the feet. The air moves in the same quiet way. The horizon does not shift. Nothing confirms that anything has changed. And yet, the position is different. The space that was once observed from within is now occupied from without. The figure does not move further. The moment holds, not as arrival, not as escape, but as presence in a place that has not yet been claimed by movement. You notice how the crossing does not alter the camp behind. It continues as it was, holding its quiet patterns, its fading structures, its softened boundaries. The fence remains where it is, still marking a division that has now been passed through without being removed. The boundary has not disappeared. It has been crossed. Elsewhere along the perimeter, similar moments begin to unfold. A person pauses at another irregularity in the fence. Another stands near a place where the ground rises just enough to reduce the distance beneath the wire. These spaces, once invisible, now gather attention. Not all are used. Not all lead to crossing. But they are seen, held within awareness, no longer dismissed. Inside the camp, the change is not immediate. Movement continues, but it carries a different quality. The edge is no longer only approached. It is no longer only observed. It has been passed through. This knowledge does not spread as a message. It does not move from one person to another in any visible way. It exists in the space itself, in the subtle shifts of posture, in the way bodies remain near the boundary without turning away as quickly, in the way attention lingers longer at the edge. You watch as another figure moves toward the fence, reaches a similar opening, and pauses. The moment mirrors the one before it, but it is not the same. There is less hesitation now, not because certainty has arrived, but because the possibility has already been realized once. The body does not need to discover it entirely on its own. It moves within a space where something has already changed. The step that follows is again small, again quiet, again without announcement. And once more, the boundary is passed. On the other side, the figure remains, not moving outward into the distance, not leaving the space behind entirely, but holding position in a way that suggests the crossing itself is not yet the beginning of departure. The outside remains unclaimed, not empty, not unknown, but not yet inhabited in a way that carries direction. The watchtowers stand unchanged, their emptiness now complete. They no longer relate to what is happening at the edge. The crossing occurs without them, without reference to what once defined the boundary. Their presence has no influence here. You begin to sense that crossing does not lead immediately to leaving. It creates a new space, a space where inside and outside no longer exist as separate conditions, but as positions that can be moved between without the same force that once defined them. The fence remains. The camp remains. The outside remains. But the distance between them has changed. And within that change, the first movement beyond the boundary has occurred, not as an end, not as a beginning, but as a quiet shift that continues to unfold. The space beyond the fence. Beyond the boundary, the ground does not announce itself as different. It holds the same quiet surface, the same uneven textures shaped by time rather than by instruction. The air moves without interruption, carrying no trace of what has been left behind. There is no visible line that separates one side from the other, no mark that confirms the crossing as something that has changed the nature of the space itself. And yet, the position within it carries a difference that cannot be seen from a distance. The figures who have crossed remain close. They do not move far from the fence. They stand within reach of it, as though the boundary still holds them in place, not through force, but through familiarity that has not yet been released. The body does not turn outward fully. It does not orient itself toward the horizon. It remains near the edge, holding both spaces at once. You notice how movement continues to follow the line of the boundary. A figure walks along the outside of the fence, tracing its shape from the other side. The motion is steady, not exploratory, not driven by urgency, but by a quiet continuation of what has already begun. The fence remains present, now behind instead of before, but still central to how movement unfolds. The outside does not draw them further. It does not suggest direction. It does not provide structure. It remains open, without pattern, without indication of where to go or how to move within it. The absence of direction does not immediately create freedom. It creates a space that must be understood before it can be entered fully. Inside the camp, movement continues as before, but with a subtle awareness of what has changed. Figures approach the boundary with less hesitation. The distance to the fence shortens more quickly. The pauses remain, but they do not hold as long. The edge has been altered, not physically, but in how it is experienced. It is no longer only a limit. It is a place where movement can continue. You watch as another person reaches an opening and crosses. The motion is quieter now, less extended, as though the body has begun to recognize the action without needing to dwell within it. The step through the boundary is still small, still measured, but it no longer holds the same weight of uncertainty. On the other side, they remain, not moving outward, not leaving the edge behind. The space beyond the fence begins to fill, not with movement, but with presence. A small number of figures stand, walk slowly along the boundary, or remain still, holding position in a space that has not yet been shaped by routine. Their distance from one another varies, not according to any pattern, but according to something that has not yet formed into structure. You begin to sense that the outside is not immediately lived. It is first observed. The body does not move into it with the same patterns it carried within the camp. It does not yet know how to occupy it. The habits that once guided movement no longer apply in the same way, and nothing has replaced them. The result is a quiet stillness, not imposed, but emerging. A figure stands facing outward, then shifts slightly, then remains. Another walks a short distance away from the fence, then stops, as though the continuation of movement requires something that has not yet been found. The fence, now behind them, continues to hold its presence. It marks where they have come from, not as something that pulls them back, but as something that still defines the edge of what has been understood. The boundary has been crossed, but it has not been left behind entirely. It remains within the field of awareness, shaping how far movement extends. The watchtowers stand unchanged in the distance. From this side, they appear the same, their emptiness just as complete, their presence just as detached. They do not frame the outside. They do not define it. They remain connected to the space that is now behind, no longer central to what is unfolding beyond the fence. You begin to understand that the outside is not the opposite of the camp. It is something that has not yet been defined. It does not carry the structure that once governed movement. It does not yet hold a new one. And within that absence, the body remains close to what it knows, even as it begins to stand in a space where that knowledge no longer applies. The space beyond the fence does not fill all at once. It gathers slowly, not through movement outward, but through presence that remains near the boundary. The figures who have crossed do not spread into the distance. They linger close, as though the edge itself continues to define how far the body can extend, even from the other side. You notice how the first steps away from the fence are shorter than expected. A person moves outward, then stops after only a few paces, holding position as if the space ahead has not yet offered a way to continue. Another takes a similar path, stepping slightly farther, then turning back toward the boundary, not returning through it, but reorienting toward what is already known. The outside does not resist, but it does not guide either. It remains open, without pattern, without direction, offering no structure to carry movement forward. The absence of structure does not immediately become freedom. It becomes a condition that must be inhabited before it can be understood. Inside the camp, the same quiet awareness continues to shift. Fewer people remain at the center. Movement draws outward more frequently, toward the edges that no longer hold the same weight. The interior spaces remain occupied, but they no longer gather presence in the same way. The balance of the camp has changed, not visibly, but in how attention moves through it. You watch as another figure approaches the fence, pauses briefly, and then crosses with a motion that carries less hesitation than before. The body lowers slightly, passes through the irregular space, and emerges on the other side without stopping at the boundary. The pause that once held the moment has shortened. The crossing no longer requires the same length of awareness. On the outside, the figure remains close, not out of fear, not out of restraint, but because the space beyond still has no form to receive them. The ground extends outward without marking paths, without suggesting direction. The horizon offers no distinction between one place and another. The body does not yet know how to move within it in the same way it moved within the camp, so it stays near the edge. You begin to notice how the fence continues to anchor movement, even from this side. People walk along it, tracing its length, using it as a reference point in a space that has none. The boundary remains a line that can be followed, even when it no longer defines where one can or cannot go. It becomes a guide, not through authority, but through familiarity. A figure walks parallel to the fence, then stops, then steps away from it slightly, then returns. The movement does not extend far. It remains contained within a narrow band of space where the boundary is still visible. The body does not yet move into the open ground with confidence. It remains within reach of what it understands, even as it stands beyond it. The watchtowers, seen now from the outside, hold no greater meaning. They stand as distant structures, detached from the movement that unfolds near the fence. Their presence does not define this space. They belong to what is behind, to a system that has already begun to fade. You begin to sense that the outside is not immediately lived as a new condition. It is approached as an extension of the old one. The body carries its patterns, its memory, its orientation toward boundaries, and brings them into a space where they no longer apply in the same way. The result is a quiet hesitation, not at the moment of crossing, but in what follows. A figure takes several steps away from the fence, then stops, turning slightly, not to return, but to maintain awareness of where they have come from. The outside does not pull them further. It does not offer direction. It remains open, waiting without intention. And within that openness, the body begins to adjust, not by moving farther, but by remaining where it is, allowing the space to exist without needing to be immediately understood. The fence remains behind. The camp remains intact. But the space beyond has begun to hold presence, even if it has not yet become a place of movement. And in that quiet extension, something continues to unfold, not as departure, not as arrival, but as the slow beginning of inhabiting what has never been lived before. Epilogue. Aftermath. The camp does not vanish. It remains where it stood, long after the movements within it have changed. The barracks hold their shape against the weather. The fence continues its quiet line across the ground. The watchtowers, empty and unchanged, rise into the sky with no one left to stand within them. Time moves across these structures without asking anything of them, touching wood, wire, and earth in the same patient way it always has. Beyond the fence, the ground stretches outward without memory. It does not record the first steps that crossed into it. It does not hold the hesitation that followed. The space remains open, carrying no trace of what it has begun to contain. Wind passes over it without pause. Light shifts across it without marking the moment when it became something different. You can stand at the edge now, where the boundary once held its certainty. The wire is still there, but it no longer explains anything. It does not separate in the same way. It does not define what belongs to one side or the other. It remains as a form without force, a line that has outlived the meaning it once carried. Inside, the camp has lost its center. There is no single place that gathers attention, no point toward which movement returns. The structures remain, but they no longer work together. Each stands on its own, connected by proximity, but not by purpose. The space that once held everything in alignment has opened, allowing what was contained to move without being drawn back. Outside, movement has extended, but not in a straight line. It has spread slowly, unevenly, carried by bodies that have had to learn how to move without direction. The first steps remained close to the fence. The next extended slightly farther. Over time, the distance between the boundary and the body increased, not through decision, but through the gradual release of what once held it in place. The outside did not become freedom all at once. It became something that had to be understood without instruction, something that had to be lived before it could be named. The memory of the camp does not leave quickly. It remains in posture, in movement, in the way space is approached and occupied. The body continues to carry what it has learned, even as the environment no longer requires it. That memory fades, but not evenly. It loosens in some places, holds in others, shaping the transition without defining its end. The fence remains behind, but it does not disappear. It becomes part of the landscape, something that can be seen without being followed. Its presence no longer directs movement, but it continues to mark where something once ended, even if that ending no longer applies. The watchtowers stand longer than the memory of what they held. Their emptiness remains complete, untouched by the movement that has passed beyond them. They no longer oversee anything. They no longer belong to what is lived. They exist as remnants of a structure that has already dissolved. And yet, they remain. You can still see them from a distance, rising above the ground, unchanged, holding a shape that no longer carries the same weight. They do not fade quickly. They do not collapse. They persist, as many things do, long after their meaning has thinned. The camp, the boundary, the outside, none of them resolve into a single moment. There is no clear end, no point where one state becomes another. Only a gradual shift, carried through time, through movement, through the quiet adjustment of how space is lived. You stand where the edge once held. The wind moves lightly across the ground. Nothing calls you forward. Nothing pulls you back. The space remains open, not as something to be taken, but as something that continues to exist without asking to be understood. And in that quiet, where structure has loosened and meaning has thinned, what remains is not absence. It is the lingering shape of what once held everything in place, still present, still felt, even as it slowly, almost imperceptibly, lets go.